Welcome to a new season of Primetime at the BU Library. Primetime at the BU Library's mission is to encourage lifelong learning beyond the classroom for faculty, students, and staff. The presentations are a collaboration of many different offices on campus with the Friends of the BU Library. Faculty who are here, please be on the lookout for research papers that your students are writing this year that they can submit for the highly prized $250 Library Research Prize. And the deadline is February 15th. Join us next Tuesday when Dr. Ray Van Aragon will be presenting In Praise of the Geography. Today we're kicking off our new season with an Edgren Award winners, Dr. Dan Ritchie and Amy Riggins. They'll be presenting on the global citizen without a country, what Edmund Burke can teach today's cosmopolitans. Let me just say a few thoughts about what the Edgren Scholars Program is and the history. The Edgren Scholars Program supports faculty student research teams as they collaborate on a research project. The project must be one that has the potential to make a significant contribution to a given field of study, and the project must reflect meaningful collaboration on research between students and faculty. The Edgren Scholars Program is named after John Alexis Edgren, the founder of what is now Bethel University. Edgren's vision for Christian higher education is evidenced in many ways at Bethel. The focus on collaborative research between students and faculty in the Edgren Scholars Program clearly reflects Edgren's own vision for the educational process. One of the key principles that Edgren articulated in the 19th century was that the relation between teachers and pupils shall not be that of commander and subject, but one of true friendship and helpfulness. It's interesting to note that Edgren said that the relationship between students and teachers is not that of commander and subject. He spent considerable time in military service, so he knew the commander-subject model, and that it's not the model for students and teachers. Rather, he characterized the student-teacher relationship of one of friendship and helpfulness. So we seize the fruits of that as faculty and students work closely together, and we'll get to hear particularly about the work that Dr. Dan Ritchie, professor of English and director of the Humanities Program, and Amy Riggins, English major, the work they did this summer on Edmund Burke.
Thanks a lot, Deb. And we do want to thank the Edmund Scholars Program. It's an extremely generous and very encouraging program for all of us who've received that. Now, our project is to look at the growing popularity of the global citizen movement in higher education, particularly against a backdrop of a declining emphasis on the study of one's own culture, and in our case, that would be American culture. We've defined this project as the global citizen without a country, which alludes to a short story that was published during the Civil War by Edward Everett Hale, The Man Without a Country. We're concerned about two problems in particular. The first is the abstract and highly theoretical nature of the global citizenship movement. And the second is the negative relationship that it often sets up between one's own culture compared to an imagined global society. And really, the image that I grabbed off the internet shows how these two problems are interrelated. In writings on global citizenship or cosmopolitanism, actual social reality can be held up as lacking. It always is. And of course, this is true. Families, actual education, health systems, legal citizenship, political authority, religious customs, all of these do have grave deficiencies. But to merge these two problems, the global citizen rarely has to confront them. Actual problems will be solved by some theoretical institution of the future, perhaps a restructured UN, which will follow policies on the basis of sound, though abstract principles. But look at this passport for a minute. As you'll see, it's really a U.S. passport. It's a U.S. passport in every respect, except the map is different and the words are different. The problem that we kept coming up against is the difficulty and perhaps the impossibility of actually imagining what this very abstract concept would look like without reference to the actual nature of real nation states. Well, our proposal is to draw on the past, and particularly the example of Edmund Burke's efforts on behalf of India, to provide a different model for creating global sympathies. We're after the same things, really, global harmony, greater global understanding, but we looked at it in a different way. Now, Burke led the efforts to impeach the Governor General of India and then put him on trial in the House of Lords. And so he had to create sympathy in Britain for the people of India. He had to create sympathy so that they would go against their own British official. And his strategy had three parts that we're going to look at. First, cultivating affection for the good practices in one's own culture. Second, finding affinities to those practices in other cultures. And third, seeking a deeper underlying order. For Burke, it would be in natural law or in providence. An order that binds these practices together. Now, note that this begins with affection for the practices within one's own culture. Why is this important? I mean, if our goals are roughly the same, what does it matter where you start from? If you're seeking global citizenship or a different model in global sympathy? Well, it matters because the words that we use do matter. Good thinking always matters. National citizenship actually means something very particular in particular nations. Amy and I went to a couple of immigration classes run by some wonderful people mostly from my church. And it's for immigrants who are getting ready to take the U.S. citizenship exam. These were folks from Mexico, Belarus, Iran, and Somalia. And they are not interested in world citizenship. They were interested in U.S. citizenship. They said their main interest is in voting. In other words, they wanted to have control over their lives. They didn't want to be harassed by a government. They wanted a better economic life for their children. They wanted to own their own property. These are actual rights that they wanted to enjoy, along with the responsibilities of citizens. Secondly, where you begin a political analysis matters. Your point of departure, to use terms from Tocqueville, matters. In his analysis of democracy in America, Tocqueville begins with Puritan New England. And this means that he focuses on the kind of religious equality that you see in Puritanism, civic engagement, and those sorts of things, rather than what you might find if you started, say, in the South. So where you start matters. Now, for some advocates of global citizenship, the point of departure is in actual organizations, whether it's the United Nations or World Vision, Amnesty International, and so on. This is a more attractive approach in our view because it does begin with actual institutions. But for most of the advocates of global citizenship, the point of departure is in a theory of justice, a theory of humanity, in which actual nations, laws, and cultural practices are viewed as arbitrary or contingent, or often as primarily negative. To think theologically for a moment, the notion that the actual embodied practices of your life can be separated from their deeper meaning is a kind of Gnosticism, isn't it? Separating, in the theological case, separating the theological meaning from the actual physical presence is what we call Gnosticism. You can like the idea of humanity while really not liking your neighbor very much. Or to use Linus's words, you can love mankind, but it's just people that you can't stand. Now finally, there are a lot of solid study abroad programs, international studies programs that have been subsumed under the title of global studies or global citizenship. And some of these programs no doubt welcome this development. But we wonder whether the underpinning of global citizenship will ultimately undermine them. Here's why. Because they generally degrade the detailed study of particular cultures. To put it a different way, the appeal to purely global sources of authority undermines the significance of diversity. So ironically, the current trend toward global citizenship tends to undermine the previous trend in higher education toward diversity because it denies the real significance of embodied cultural practices of diverse cultures. Now, what's the basis for our saying that there's been a rise in the popularity of global citizenship? And here I'm going to let Amy take over.
Well, one of my main purposes in this project was to determine how widespread the global citizenship movement has been in higher education. I researched the top 50 national schools and top 25 liberal arts colleges according to the U.S. News and World Report rankings, and allocated a list of institutes, centers, offices, majors, minors, programs, departments, initiatives, which I'll just call programs, which include global citizenship in their title, and analyzed their histories, mission statements, activities, and curricula. I found that over half of these schools on both lists have global citizenship programs. Some of these are little more than study abroad offices, but the fact that they profess to creating citizens of the world shows that the term is pervasive. Even more telling is that of the programs for which I could find starting dates, only 4 were launched before 2001. Now, as a former biology major, I felt a duty to make the scientists in the room feel a little more at home. So I plotted the starting dates I could find on this nice graph. And as you can see by the way I formatted the graph, there's a strong increase in the number of global citizenship programs in higher education since 2001. And we speculate that the global citizenship movement in higher education is a response to many things outside of academia, such as 9/11. Indeed, many of the programs include terrorism studies in their curricula. Furthermore, in his book summarizing the study he did on self-proclaimed global citizens, Hans Schattel also said that, quote, the polarizing attributes of George W. Bush and his administration have turned the U.S. presidency into a point of contention concerning global citizenship. Perhaps the biggest change since 2000 in media discourse concerning the United States as a global citizen was an increase in published references that essentially described Bush as a personal barrier that separated the U.S. from good global citizenship. Now, Schattel was talking about the media and global citizens who were not necessarily in academia. We speculate that the global citizenship movement in higher education has been academia's way of distancing itself from controversial political policies, especially the Bush administration.
We forgot to show the animation. So there's 9/11 for you, and there's Bush reelected. Okay. So yeah, this was difficult research, this quantitative element. So the global citizenship programs are increasing. What's our basis for saying that interest in teaching of American culture is declining? Nearly all of the institutions that Amy surveyed all of them have history departments and many have American studies programs. Well, in the first place, apart from law schools, you don't hear very much about these programs, at least not on the websites. And none of the programs that Amy surveyed require any study of American culture. But this leads to a second and broader concern. The number of institutions on that U.S. News top 50 schools that require the study of history has declined significantly. In 1964, 40% of them required a history course. In 1993, only 6 of them did so, and none of them required the study of American or Western history. Third, teaching about American culture doesn't seem to be a high priority among American faculty. UCLA's Higher Education Research Institute has been surveying us, we took this survey last year, about faculty priorities since 1989, and they don't even ask whether teaching about your own culture, in this case American culture, is a priority. So among the top 20 priorities, teaching about your own culture is not even listed as a priority. And finally, and perhaps most important, the theorists of global citizenship maintain that citizenship in an actual nation state is merely accidental or contingent. So the theorists of this movement often see their goals, and we have many quotes to back this up, in competition with the moral value or authority one might give one's own nation. And this is a student who's been forced into a history class by an institution that really doesn't care that much.
I know the look. Wow.
You know the we all know the look. Okay. Well, our point is less theoretical than practical, and so we wanted to give you the example that's often referred to by these folks of a global citizen, and it turns out that the example is Thomas Paine, who was Burke's great antagonist during the French Revolution. Before we get to Paine, let me call your attention to that handout. We put some definitions and descriptions of global citizenship. It was quite difficult to find these. It's an interesting issue in itself. The first definition of global citizenship There are two sides, and the first definition is that it is the recognition that we're members of the wider community of all humanity, the world, or a similar whole that's wider than a nation state. This membership involves a significant identity, loyalty, or commitment beyond the nation state. And then if you skip down to the descriptions of global citizenship, about the third or fourth description is that global citizenship finds much of its practical expression in NGOs, that is, non-government organizations. Well, let's look at these definitions and descriptions. Of the definition, we would argue that it's too general to be meaningful. All adherents of a universal religion, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, would affirm that they're members of a whole that's wider than that of a nation state. Many who work for multinational corporations have a significant identity or loyalty beyond the nation state. That doesn't make them citizens in any political sense. Without a membership in a self-sustaining community with a culture, legal, social, religious, the definition seems to lack significance. And in particular, it avoids all of the actual problems that a real nation must face. And of the description about participating in an NGO, we like NGOs. We're committed to NGOs. But what happens when an NGO or an international government organization, an IGO, becomes corrupt? What happens when the UN's Oil for Food program has millions and millions of dollars derailed to the regime of Saddam Hussein, or when the UN fails to halt genocide, or regime-induced starvation? What happens when the Non-Proliferation Treaty fails to prevent Iran and North Korea from developing nuclear programs? Well, these problems are mostly overlooked, or the advocates of globalism propose to grant even more power to the organizations where they occur. In other words, they don't seem to take into account the possibility of human corruption of all institutions, including NGOs. Third, participating in NGOs is completely voluntary. You may be supporting World Vision or the International Justice Mission now. That's great, but you're not obligated to. And even if you continue your support, you don't necessarily have a right to affect its policies. In an actual democratic republic, by contrast, you are required to pay your taxes, to serve on juries, and you do have the right to vote, to petition the government for redress of grievances, to protect your property. Now, let's go back to Thomas Paine. Paine is really our global citizen without a country. His book, The Rights of Man, is an extremely theoretical treatment of the French Revolution. It compares the French and the American revolutions, finds great similarities between them, as Jefferson did, but Hamilton did not. And Paine is often quoted this way: "My attachment is to all the world and not to any particular part." And that captures the problem perfectly. He was originally from England, and he transferred his loyalties to America. He was very good at stirring up the revolutionary spirit in 1776, but even then, John Adams concluded that Paine had a better hand at pulling down than building up. Eager to drum up American support for the French Revolution, he dedicated The Rights of Man, 1791, to George Washington. But Washington rejected Paine's advice and decided on neutrality as between Britain and France during the Revolutionary Wars. Paine accepted an honorary French citizenship and accepted a seat in the French National Assembly, even though he didn't understand French very well. So here he is legislating for France, and he doesn't understand the language. He was thrown into prison during the Terror, and then he blamed Washington for not springing him free. Well, why was Paine angry? Well, it seems that now our world citizen was claiming American citizenship and the rights pertaining thereto. His claim of U.S. citizenship was rather sketchy, but after his release, a particular ambassador, James Monroe, from a particular country, and you can guess which one, took him into his home in Paris. So the choice of Paine is kind of a paradigm of the problems that we see in the typical approach to global citizenship. First, our willingness to use an anecdote from history, Paine's life, without studying the actual circumstances surrounding it. Second, the exaltation of theory over practical politics. And third, when things go bad, blame Washington. Now, let's go back to Burke here. Our alternative is to seek global sympathy as an outgrowth of local practices and affections, and then seeking affinities in other cultures, and then seeing the underlying similarity. I have said that Burke led the efforts to impeach the Governor General of India and put him on trial in the House of Lords. Let me give you some quick background. There's more on this sheet, but quickly, by 1764, the East India Company had decisively added political and military power to their commercial interests in India. But bribery, failure to comply with company standards, the oppression of India's peoples and leaders, and the unauthorized use of armed force moved Burke to lead an impeachment effort against the Governor General Warren Hastings. Despite much opposition, Burke succeeded in leading a successful impeachment vote in the House of Commons in 1788, and Hastings then goes on trial, and the trial lasts for 7 years. Now, our explanation of Burke's role runs counter to one of the dominant theories in literary studies right now. It's called Orientalism. And so we're going to pause for just a minute. I'm going to ask Amy to explain that approach.
Okay. So in the introduction of his book, Orientalism, Edward Said defines his theory as, quote, a relationship of power, of domination, and of varying degrees of complex hegemony between the Occident and the Orient. So basically this means that the West dominates the East. The Orientalist, says Said, assumes the superiority of the West and the inferiority of the East. The East is presented as a monolithic other to the West. This painting, which appeared on the book's cover, encapsulates Said's argument. The East is primitive, exotic, and charged according to the European, and everything not European. He continues, Orientalism depends for its strategy on this superiority, which puts the Westerner in a whole series of possible relationships with the Orient without ever losing the upper hand. Orientalism is a Western creation of domination over the East, or the Orient, with its own complex history and discourse. So why have we been studying Orientalism? Well, it was an important text in literary studies, and continues to be. It is widely read in academia, and still greatly debated. We're not the first to poke holes in Said's argument. Indeed, many literary scholars continue to consider Orientalism to be somewhat dated. However, it is still an important text, which set a precedent in academia that the West has always othered the East, which still persists today, even if some of the specifics of Said's theory have been questioned. So what's our problem with Orientalism? Well, Burke just doesn't fit into it. Said's blanket statements about Western culture dominating the East don't cover Burke. Burke's writings and actions trip the theory up and show its shortcomings. Burke is an interesting figure for literary scholars. He, like many of his contemporaries, said things that could be classified as Orientalist. For example, in some passages he paints the Indians out to be stereotypically pastoral and very in tune with nature. But in many, many, many more places, Burke does not fit into the Orientalist box. For example, he defies the Orientalist stereotype by not making India out to be a monolithic other. Instead, having studied the Indian culture extensively, Burke stresses the diversity of the Indian peoples and their different religions. At the very least, Burke viewed the Indians as equals to Britons. He appeals to the House of Lords to, quote, respect a people as respectable as yourselves, a people who knows as well as you what is rank, what is law, what is property, equity, reason, proportion in punishments, security of property. Going even further, on multiple occasions Burke goes so far as to demonize the young British men who sought fortunes in India at the expense of the colonized people. The young Britons lack what Burke calls sympathy, or we would probably use the term empathy, for the Indians. Burke's knowledge of and respect for the Indians is evident in many places. He says that they are a people for ages civilized and cultivated by all the arts of polished life, whilst we, the Europeans, were yet in the woods. Having extensively researched India, Burke realizes that the Europeans are actually the ones deficient in history when compared to the Indians. Burke just doesn't fit into Said's theory of a European who disrespects and dominates the Indian other. So maybe we need to replace the word dominate with another word that applies to Burke. How about instead of dominate, we say relate? Burke was merely trying to relate to the Indians. His drawing of parallels between Europe and India were sometimes inaccurate, and some might argue too European to be entirely precise. However, he was trying to inspire an audience to stop dominating and to start relating. And the only way to do that was to bring up similarities to emphasize the common humanity between the British and the Indians.
So let's turn now to the Burkean understanding. The best scholarship on Burke in the last 20 years has gone to some lengths to show that Burke's strategy on India involved exploring affinities, that is, what Amy was talking about with regard to relating the importance of property, the rule of law, Islamic and Hindu law. Burke often appeals to natural law during the India speeches. In part, he appeals to natural law in order to trump the tyrannical practices that the East India Company had justified. Natural law overcomes the claim that despotic practices are somehow okay in India. Burke will have none of this. I impeach Warren Hastings, he says, by those eternal laws of justice which he has violated. So Burke's appeal to standards beyond merely British law or British culture does indeed link him with cosmopolitan thinking. Customs can be unjust. Laws can and often do run counter to our humanity. But when Burke refers to natural law, he means something quite different from abstract rights, whether of Global Citizens or Thomas Paine. He charges that English common law and Islamic law also condemn Hastings. He defends his right to try Hastings not on the basis of a universal law, but on the basis of British law. So what are we to make of Burke's mixture of the universal and the local? How do they fit together? Well, unlike most of the institutes and books of today that promote global citizenship, Burke's writings never treat moral laws as abstractions. The rights he discusses are never merely theoretical, and their application to particular societies is never merely accidental or arbitrary, and that's Martha Nussbaum's terms, although she's changed her mind on this, interestingly. Burke abominated the French revolutionaries' language of rights, in part, he said, because they could not embody their principles in actual institutions. Providence and natural law came alive for Burke because his moral imagination saw them through the actual constitutions and social practices of English history, of Islamic customs, and of Hindu society as well. It's striking that Burke almost never speaks of Asia, or of the Orient, or even of India, as if it's a single unity. Time and again, he treats of Islamic customs, or Hindu customs. In other words, the actual embodied practice of this people. And he treats them as local efforts to transmit the transcendent requirements of the divine order to particular people in particular places. Well, let me give one quick example of how Burke's sympathy worked. Actually, I think I'll skip that because I want to have a little time for discussion. I was looking for a way to illustrate this whole process here. Local affection, something that you appreciate locally, affinities between cultures, and then getting to a universal truth. And I knew Marion was going to be in the audience today, so I was looking for some image that she particularly might appreciate. And many of you can complete the rest of this sentence. For a universal truth. It's not really natural law, but it's close. It is a truth universally acknowledged that what? A young man in possession of a large fortune must be in want of a wife. And indeed, it's not exactly a natural law, but apparently it's something that is not only known by Mr. Darcy, or rather Mrs. Bennett, in Pride and Prejudice, but it's known in India as well. And so, whoa, there we are. And so Indian filmmakers have remade Pride and Prejudice, not on the basis perhaps of natural law, but still the similar kind of local effect. Amy doesn't like this slide.
I love it.
Good. Well, here's the point. The approach that we're suggesting requires detailed study and experience in the customs of another culture, not theory. It's the opposite of beginning with theory. It begins with learning about real persons, going to the, helping out with the immigration class, or studying abroad and really trying to understand religious family structures, laws, other mores. It begins, in other words, where most real people begin. It begins where most of us begin, not in a Gnostic world of theory abstracted from practice, where actual communities are considered accidental, but theories are somehow considered real. I'm showing my Aristotelian side, my non-Platonic side here. To speak more theologically, it begins with incarnation. It begins with presence. It moves on to relationship, to affinities, and only then does it rise to the level of the universal. And it's our hope that people, that students and faculty and others will listen to these experiences and reflect on them more as we move into a more and more interconnected future. Well, thanks very much. We have about 7 or 8 minutes, I think, for questions. So, anyone should come up too. I know it's hard to ask the first question, so I'll take the second question. Okay, Samuel.
Mine is just a brief comment. I think what is so interesting about Burke is that even the kind of dominant discourse going on in the United States, many people think that conservatives do not have something to say about the kind of concern that we had about India. But it's interesting to see Burke, the founder of considered to be one of the founders of the conservative movement, that having this kind of real serious commitment to India, which shows that people can come from different traditions, but at some point they can still have sympathy for other cultures. But some of the critical comments that I want to make is, I think if one looks at the global citizenship literature, there are some critical points there that should be able to address some of the things that you mentioned, because increasingly now what we find out is that there's a trend toward consumer status rather than citizenship, which means in the 21st century, one of the serious embarrassment or concern that many people in the United States are going to have is that they would have more power on the basis of their consumer status than their citizenship. You can be a citizen of the United States, but because of this whole ideology, which I don't think Burke would be happy with, it creates a situation where, yeah, I can be an American, I have the Declaration of Independence, I have the Constitution, but I can go hungry. Okay? But you can be living in India, if you're working for a multinational corporation, you can make a lot of money and live better than somebody in the United States. So under these circumstances, in the 21st century, what is citizenship going to really become? Is it going to just be something on paper, or does it have any kind of material substance that is attached to that? There are other comments I would like to make, but I would like to start.
Do you want to try to address? You know, Samuel, I think one of the, among the critics of cosmopolitanism or global citizenship, they're not all made by people from the right. They're often people from the left. And one of the comments by a guy named David Miller and Will Kinlicka as well is that the real connections that human beings really have are nurtured by the actual communities they live in. And to the degree that there are injustices or there's poverty, the way it really gets taken care of is if political leaders or NGOs or whatever can muster the sentiment that's going to overcome it. And that happens largely within nations. It doesn't happen across large consumer relations. I mean, the people who are, you should eat the rest of your food because there are people starving elsewhere. That just doesn't work. So I don't think anything that we've said solves the problem that you're addressing. But the resources for solving it, I think, lie in the communal, political, social, religious relationships that are probably better nurtured within nations at this point.
I guess Samuel saying kind of makes me think of my main hesitation here, which is your definition of citizenship as being formal membership in a political community. So I think Samuel has pointed out in consumership could be participation in an economic community, but I actually thought more of something you alluded to, which is, isn't the global religion a defeater for the Williams and Dower definition of global citizenship? Participation in the Christian church, a kind of global citizenship. So why can't citizenship be formal membership of a religious community? What does that require of the nation? And bringing it back to Burke, then I wonder, isn't Burke missing a first step? If we're going to talk about this as an incarnational understanding of citizenship, doesn't it start with something as universal as that God sent His Son for the world, and then we incarnate that wherever we have to live? So I guess I was wondering where you would see citizenship in the body of Christ fitting into your system.
You want to handle that? Yeah, there's a great passage also in the Reflections where he says, "We know, and it is our pride to know, that man is a religious animal," something like that. So he does begin with religion as the basis of society, as opposed to, say, fear of violent death for Hobbes, or protecting life, liberty, and property for Locke. Now, he couldn't really criticize Locke out loud. He just didn't do that in the 18th century. But there's a profound sense in which the beginning of citizenship for Burke really is religious. And he makes a very big point of this in the India speeches, that the kind of loyalties, the kind of commitments, the rule of law, the approaches to justice, as he studies India, are founded in Hindu and Islamic traditions as well. So Burke does make that move toward a global or cosmopolitan loyalty on the basis of religion, not on the basis of what it means to be British or an inhabitant of a particular region in India. So I think he does acknowledge that. On the other hand, the actual protection of rights and the participation for most of us in most of what we do is in communities is much more local for him. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, what it actually is, I don't know if you want to continue this, but I think in terms of where global citizenship programs show up in higher education, I wonder if you ever looked at, say, Mennonite schools. Because I would wonder if that's a different model of global citizenship that's rooted in participation in fairly non-national religious community. But it's also very different than, Paine kind of abstract.
Yeah. Adam.
You cited the rising global studies. I was wondering if the same criticisms that you applied to those actually could be applied to, say, the Fulbright program that was put together and primarily academically driven, student scholars. That started post World War II, and if there's something that's particularly different in the way that that program was initiated and how it's changed.
I don't know the history of that. Do you know?
Oh, so Senator Fulbright.
Well, I know how it got started, but seems like a great idea to me, especially if they get money to faculty.
Well, I guess I've only known how it's worked as a participant. It really encouraged a huge amount of interaction with a variety of local organizations.
Right.
So,
Right.
There has been a lot of grassroots.
Absolutely.
I was just wondering, and I don't know much about the local studies program, but is there sort of these two that converge with one another, and so the criticisms that you're directed toward global studies programs also are directed toward sort of Fulbright?
Oh, I don't know enough about it, and it seems, I mean, the people that I've known that have done this have gotten extremely involved in local local societies and created relationships, and that's seems like exactly the right thing to do. Our own study abroad programs, we emphasize this kind of thing all the time. Yeah, but it's more the theoretical piece that we're raising questions about. It's 11 o'clock, and so should we go ahead and end here? I'm going to stick around for a while. Are you going to stick around?
Just a little bit.
Okay. And there's more food, so thanks a lot for coming.